The air that night carried a bite to it, the kind of cold that settled deep in your bones. Main Street looked the same as always, cars rolling past, neon signs buzzing, the smell of fried food drifting from the diner's kitchen vent. The bell over the door jingled every few minutes as customers came and went, carrying takeout boxes or leftover pie in paper bags. And on the sidewalk, pressed against the wall just beneath a flickering streetlight, sat the man no one seemed to see. His blanket was thin, pulled tight around his shoulders. In front of him rested a paper cup with only a few coins clinking inside. He didn't shout, he didn't wave people down. He just sat quietly, his head bent, his hands shaking against the cold. People passed by like he wasn't there at all. A mother tugged her child closer. A pair of teenagers laughed and tossed an empty soda can near his feet. A man in a suit tightened his scarf and stepped off the curb to avoid him entirely. To most, he was nothing more than part of the background, like the cracked pavement or the peeling paint on the diner's awning. But then came that glance. Inside, a young waitress was clearing a booth, balancing plates on her tray, her hair pulled back in a plain ponytail. She was tired, the kind of tired that came from long shifts and short paychecks. As she pushed through the side door to drop a bag of trash in the bin, her eyes drifted across the street, and for the first time she really saw him. His face caught the glow of the diner's lights, and in that light his eyes lifted. Not begging, not demanding, just empty in a way that stopped her in her tracks. She froze, the trash bag hanging from her hand, staring longer than she meant to. She could have walked back inside. Most people did, pretend you didn't notice, pretend it wasn't your problem. But something about that look clung to her as she turned away. And that was how it began. Not with a speech or a grand gesture, but with a pause. One pair of tired eyes meeting another on an ordinary American street. That night, even after she dropped the trash and went back inside, the look in his eyes followed her. It clung to her as she wiped tables, poured coffee refills, and smiled at customers who barely looked her way. By the time she hung up her apron, she knew she wouldn't forget it. She lived just a few blocks away, in a small apartment above the laundromat. The rent wasn't cheap for what it was: thin walls, pipes that rattled, and the faint smell of detergent drifting up from the machines below. After her shift, she'd climb the narrow stairs, count her tips on the kitchen counter, and wonder how far they'd stretch. Usually, it wasn't far enough. Most nights she made do with whatever leftovers she brought home: a slice of pie, a half cup of soup. She told herself she was used to it. Still, it gnawed at her sometimes how hard she worked just to stay afloat. And maybe that's why the man outside the diner had gotten under her skin. At work, she noticed the little things. Half a sandwich left untouched, fries still warm when someone walked away, pie with one bite missing tossed straight into the trash. She carried the plates back to the kitchen like she was supposed to, but every time she scraped food into the bin, she thought about the man sitting just feet away on the sidewalk. It wasn't just waste, it was the sharp contrast that stung. Warm meals inside, food thrown away without a thought, and right outside someone shivering with nothing at all. She tried to brush it off, telling herself she couldn't fix the world. She barely had enough for herself. But the excuses felt thin, even as she repeated them. Because the truth was, she didn't want to become like everyone else who walked past without seeing. And though she didn't know it yet, that thought was already starting to change her. By the time the sun went down the next evening, he was back in his usual spot. Same wall, same blanket pulled tight around his shoulders, the same paper cup with a handful of coins rattling whenever someone passed too close. To most people on Main Street, he was as permanent as the cracked pavement or the leaning stop sign at the corner. Always there, always ignored. He never shouted. He never chased after anyone. Just a quiet "sir" or "ma'am," spoken so softly most pretended not to hear. When he didn't get an answer, he lowered his gaze, shoulders curling tighter. It wasn't begging as much as it was habit, a rhythm of survival. The town had learned to look past him. Parents guided their kids across the street. A delivery driver glanced at him, then turned up the radio and kept walking. Teenagers passed by in groups, sometimes tossing out a cheap joke at his expense. He never snapped back. Silence had become his armour. And yet there were hints of who he had once been, the way he sat with his back still trying to stay straight, as if clinging to old habits. The way he said thank you whenever a coin dropped into his cup, even if it was just a nickel. Those traces of dignity hadn't completely worn away. From inside the diner, she noticed. Each time she carried a tray past the window, her eyes strayed. She saw him rub his hands together against the cold. She saw how carefully he picked up each coin, counting them like they meant more than they did. And she saw those eyes again. Not empty, not wild, but holding something faint, like a spark buried deep under ash. Most people walked faster when they noticed him. She found herself slowing down, and once you really saw him, it was impossible to unsee him. The next night felt no different inside the diner. Orders came in, plates clattered in the kitchen, the coffee pot hissed and poured without pause. She moved through her shift as always, her smile steady, her feet aching. But even as she worked, she couldn't stop glancing at the window. He was there again, same blanket, same cup, same steady silence that made it too easy for everyone else to walk past. Every time she carried food to a table, she thought about him. When she set down a plate of pancakes, when she refilled a mug of hot coffee, she felt the weight of the contrast, so much wasted inside, and a man starving just outside the glass. By the end of her shift, her mind was made up. She scraped the last plates from a booth where a couple had left half their dinner untouched. Normally, it would all slide into the trash without a thought. But tonight, she hesitated. She wrapped the sandwich in napkins, scooped the fries into a paper bag, and then, after a pause, poured a fresh cup of coffee. Not leftover. Fresh. Paid for out of her own tips. She stood at the counter holding the bag and the steaming cup, nerves prickling in her chest. What if he didn't want it? What if he snapped at her? What if people thought she was foolish for even trying? Still, she pushed through the diner door. The night air was colder than she expected. He looked up when he heard her steps, eyes narrowing slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe she was walking toward him. She crouched down so she wouldn't tower over him, holding out the bag first, then the cup. Her voice was quiet but steady. "It's not much," she said, "but it's warm." For a moment he didn't move. Then slowly he reached out, his hands trembling as the steam drifted up between them. The exchange was simple, almost ordinary. But to her, it felt heavier than anything she'd carried all night. And in that small silence on the sidewalk, something shifted, for him and for her. He held the cup in both hands, almost afraid to lift it, as if the heat might vanish if he moved too quickly. Steam curled up, soft against the night air. "Thank you," he said finally. His voice was low, worn thin by years of smoke and cold nights. 2 words, but they carried more weight than she expected. She nodded, pushing the paper bag a little closer. "There's food too. It's fresh. I just got off my shift." His eyes flicked to the bag, then back to her face. Suspicion lingered, the kind that comes from being disappointed too many times. After a pause, he reached for it, setting it carefully in his lap like it was something breakable. For a while they sat in silence, just the hum of traffic down the block and the faint buzz of the diner's neon sign above them. Then he spoke again, almost like the words slipped out before he could stop them. "I used to sit inside places like this," he murmured, nodding toward the diner's glowing windows. "Coffee, a newspaper, it feels like another life now." She stayed quiet, giving him space. "I was a mechanic," he went on, his tone halting, like each word cost him effort. "Worked at the garage on Elm Street. Long hours, grease under my nails every night, but it was honest work." His hand brushed against the paper bag, and for a moment he almost smiled. "I liked fixing things." He cleared his throat, his eyes clouding again. "The shop closed. Outsourcing, they said. Cheaper to ship work somewhere else. I tried odd jobs for a while, but bills kept piling up. My wife left, took my boy with her, and then..." His voice trailed off. "Well, one day I realised I'd lost more than a job. I'd lost everything." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't rehearsed. They were broken pieces of a story no one had asked him to tell in years. She felt her throat tighten. Behind the blanket and the worn clothes was not just a stranger on the street. He was a man who had once worked, once had a family, once sat in the same booths she cleaned every night. "I'm sorry," she whispered, wishing she had more to offer than a paper bag and hot coffee. But he looked at her then, really looked, and said, "Don't be, you stopped, you saw me, that's more than most." And for the first time in a long while, his voice carried something almost like relief. She hadn't planned for anyone else to notice. To her, it was just a moment on the sidewalk, an extra sandwich, a cup of coffee, and the patience to listen. No speeches, no audience. But sometimes the quietest acts don't stay quiet. The bell above the diner door jingled, and one of the regulars stepped out. He was the kind of man who slipped in 3 nights a week, ordered meatloaf and black coffee, left a few dollars on the table, and headed home without small talk. Nobody ever paid him much attention, and he seemed to prefer it that way. Tonight, though, he paused. From the curb, he caught sight of her crouched low, apron still tied around her waist, handing food to the man everyone else ignored. He saw how she leaned in, not rushing, not recoiling, just listening. He noticed the way the man's shoulders eased as he spoke, like a weight had lifted for the first time in years. Something about it stopped him cold. Maybe it reminded him of his own father, or maybe it was just rare to see someone giving time, not just spare change. Whatever it was, he pulled out his phone. No flash, no noise, just a quick photo. She never saw him. She was still focused on the man in front of her, nodding as he haltingly shared pieces of his story. To her, it was nothing extraordinary, just the decent thing to do. By the time she stood to leave, the regular was already walking down the block, the photo tucked away in his pocket. And while she thought the night would end there, with a quiet thank you and the buzz of neon overhead, the story she had unknowingly started was already on its way to reaching more eyes than she could imagine. By the next morning, the photo was no longer just sitting in a man's pocket. It had found its way onto the town's Facebook group, a page usually filled with yard sales, lost pets, and church announcements. The caption above the picture was short, almost plain. "Not everyone walks past." That was all it said, and yet people stopped scrolling. The photo showed her crouched on the sidewalk, diner apron still tied around her waist, handing food to the man everyone recognised but never really saw. For years he had been the shadow by the streetlight. Now, in that single frame, he looked human again. The comments came quietly at first. "I've seen him there for years." Bless her heart. This town needs more of that. Nothing flashy, just neighbours talking the way neighbours do. By that afternoon, the ripple had left the screen and stepped into the street. The woman from the bakery down the block came by with a loaf of bread, wrapped warm in paper. A college kid stopped after class, pressing a pair of gloves into the man's hands. Even one of the local officers, someone who usually told him to move along, paused this time. Instead of shooing him, the officer asked if he needed help finding shelter. The man seemed stunned. He clutched the bread, turned the gloves over in his hands, nodded quietly at the officer. It was as if he didn't quite believe this sudden shift was real. Meanwhile, she went about her shift as usual, refilling coffee, clearing tables, dropping checks. She hadn't seen the post, hadn't heard the comments, but every time she glanced at the window she noticed the difference. The man outside no longer looked completely alone. By the end of the week, the picture had travelled farther than anyone expected. It wasn't viral in the way city news stories are, but in a small town, it didn't need to be. A neighbour shared it with her church group. A teacher mentioned it at school. The local paper printed a short piece under community notes, right between a story about the county fair and a reminder about trash pickup. It was enough. People began stopping more often. Not everyone, but more than before. A retired mailman left a thermos of hot soup. A mother with 2 kids brought over a bag of groceries and let her children hand it to him. Someone pinned a flyer to the wall near his spot, advertising a community centre that offered temporary housing. Each gesture was small, but to him they felt enormous. And yet, he didn't quite trust it. After so many years of being invisible, part of him kept waiting for it to stop, for the bread to run out, for the gloves to wear thin, for people to forget. Still, each day another stranger stepped forward, and each time he whispered thanks like it might hold the kindness in place a little longer. Inside the diner, she had no idea her photo was in the paper or that her name had been passed around town. She didn't know that neighbours were quietly following her example. All she saw was the man outside, no longer clutching an empty cup alone, but holding small signs of care. A scarf one day, a bag of fruit the next. Life inside the diner hadn't changed. Coffee still poured, orders still came in, tips still stacked up too slowly. But when she glanced toward the window, something was different. The man who once looked like he was fading into the sidewalk now carried himself with the faintest trace of hope. The weeks slipped by, and with them, small changes took root. He wasn't on the sidewalk every night anymore. Sometimes he was at the church pantry. Other times, people said they'd seen him sweeping outside the community centre. Slowly, the blanket gave way to a jacket, the worn shoes to something sturdier. It wasn't a miracle. It was survival, with a little dignity stitched back in. One evening, near closing time, she was wiping down the counter, already thinking about rent and the long walk home, when the diner door opened. The bell jingled, and she glanced up, expecting another regular. Instead, a man she almost didn't recognise stepped inside. He stood just beyond the doorway, hesitant, as if the room itself might reject him. His hair was trimmed short, his face clean-shaven. His shirt was plain but pressed, tucked into pants that looked borrowed but neat. His shoulders were squared, though his hands fidgeted against his sides. It took her a beat before her heart leapt. It was him. The man from the sidewalk, the one she had crouched beside with a paper bag and a cup of coffee. But now he looked different, not fixed, not whole, but steadier, as if he'd remembered he still had weight in this world. He walked slowly toward the counter, each step cautious, like he wasn't sure he belonged there. She set down the rag in her hand, her voice soft. "Hi, can I help you?" He gave a shy smile, then reached into his pocket. From it, he pulled a crumpled dollar bill and laid it gently on the counter. "I thought maybe this time," he said quietly, "I could buy you a cup of coffee." For a moment, she couldn't speak. The hum of the diner went on, dishes clinking in the back, the soft gurgle of the coffee maker, but everything else seemed to still. Her throat tightened, and finally she managed a whisper. "Yeah, I'd like that." In that simple exchange, the roles had shifted. He was no longer only the man outside the glass. He was a customer again, a person again, someone offering instead of only receiving. And for her, it was the clearest proof that one small gesture on a cold night had done far more than she ever imagined. She poured the coffee slowly, watching the steam curl into the air. He sat at the counter with his shoulders squared, holding himself in a way that was both nervous and proud. When she slid the mug toward him, he wrapped his hands around it, just like he had with the paper cup weeks before. Only this time, it wasn't about survival, it was about sharing. They didn't talk much. A few words about the coffee, a quiet laugh when she told him it was on the house. For a few minutes, the world outside, traffic, bills, the long walk home, faded into the background. What filled the space instead was simple. Two people who had seen each other when no one else bothered to look. When he finished, he placed the empty mug back on the counter and gave her a steady nod. No long speech, no dramatic thank you, just gratitude that felt heavier than words. Then he stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked out. The bell over the diner door chimed softly as it closed behind him. She stood there for a while, staring at the cup he had left behind. To anyone else, it was just another late-night customer, just another order. But she knew better. That mug carried a story. A reminder that kindness doesn't vanish when you give it away. It circles back, often when you least expect it. Life didn't suddenly get easier for her. The rent was still due. Tips still came up short some nights. The laundromat pipes still rattled through the walls upstairs. But something had shifted inside her. She had proof that what she did mattered, even if it was as small as handing over a bag of food on a cold night. And as for him, he didn't disappear from town. People still saw him, but now they saw him differently. Some days he helped at the food pantry, other days he swept outside the church steps. He wasn't invisible anymore. Their paths crossed less often after that night, but neither forgot. Because sometimes the smallest acts don't just change another person's story, they end up changing yours too. Every story leaves behind a lesson. This one reminds us that kindness doesn't have to be grand to matter. A sandwich, a cup of coffee, even a few minutes of listening can carry more weight than we realise. When we choose to see someone others overlook, we give them back a piece of their dignity. And sometimes we find our own in the process. So here's a question worth keeping. When was the last time you stopped long enough to truly see someone the world passes by? Maybe the answer could change not only their story, but yours too. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, this is Rain Inside. See you again in the next story.